Hello, welcome to episode 6 of 10 Texts on Painting with me, Matthew de Saint-Giraud, and my co-host Andrea Franchi. Today's episode is called Theory of the Dot, and it's a little bit different, though something you might need to get used to. It's a live episode, and the next few episodes will be live episodes. This one was recorded at NCAD, the National College of Art and Design in Dublin, and we were hosted there. Well, we were invited there and kind of hosted by Fire Station Studios in Dublin, which is an amazing organisation. And Sara Greavu invited us. So shout out to Sarah. Thank you to you. And of course, also thank you to everyone who hosted us at NCAD, including Mark and Niall and various other staff members working on the fine art courses there, particularly the painting courses, because of course this is a painting podcast. And thank you so much to all the audience. We didn't include the questions and answers in the in this recording, partly because they were really dependent a lot on the images that we were showing, and partly because it felt like the podcast, I don't know, basically we're still trying to find the right balance. This was our first live episode, and it's interesting to think about what that means for the listener to the podcast version of it. To that end, I kind of cut all the introduction out from this as well, because I spent a lot of time at the beginning of the live event describing how it works as a podcast and why that means it's a different kind of live event that people were used to. And I suppose for you, the important thing to say is that it's a live event. So there's audience there, and we're kind of sometimes directing ourselves towards the audience rather than to each other as we would normally in the podcast. And we're showing images. It's not like a lecture slideshow or anything, but we are referring to images. So there's probably a moment or two where me or Andrea kind of are looking at the screen saying, oh, like you can see here. But we do our best to describe what we're talking about, and hopefully that doesn't get in the way of the podcast experience very much. Who else should I say thank you to? We had an amazing time in Dublin. It was really lovely to spend time with people. Just again about that conversation, part of it was recorded, but then part of it went on into the evening as we went on to Project Art Centres to see Mariam Tafakuri's amazing exhibition, and we carried on chatting to people who'd been at the live podcast event. So we've got a few more coming up, a few in London. I think we're going to do one at Taco in Thamesmead. We're going to do one at City and Guilds on their MA Fine Art course. And eventually we're going to go to Prague and do something at the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, which is all very exciting. So watch this space for information on all these things. But for now, you can enjoy me and Andrea talking about the dot. The texts today are, this is in order of us, how we speak about them. First, we speak about Georges Seurat and particularly his work, Le Grand Jatte. And we read here Linda Nochlin's essay, Seurat's Grand Jatte, an Anti-Utopian Allegory, which was published in the Art Institute of Chicago Museum Studies in 1989. We then spoke about a very different artist, Emily Kngwarray, and we read Margo Neale's essay in the book Alhalkere, Paintings from Utopia, and the title of her piece in that book is Two Worlds, One Vision, and that's from 1998. And then finally we looked at Yayoi Kusama, thinking about a kind of wider understanding of the dot as something between, punctuation and writing and mark making. And so we read chapter 1, Smutty Daubings, of the book Punctuation, Art, Politics and Play, which is by Jennifer DeVere Brody. We also mention a number of other texts and resources in the podcast, and I will try and put a list of those up in the episode description. So yeah, Theory of the Dot. Let me know what you think about this one. This is the first time we've kind of come at the podcast with an aim in mind. And I think that's how the podcast opens, is with us trying to kind of make sense of what that aim is. All right, I hope you enjoy. Okay, so are you going to introduce the first text?
Yes.
So we're going to do it the way we do it in the podcast, where we think through the text, but I have also got some images. So we'll get to the images, don't worry. You're not going to just be looking at that online.
So as part of introducing the text, thought that first we need to introduce why this one is called Theory of the Dot. This is very different to how we usually do it. And it's something that started to come up when we were doing the Philip Guston podcast. Matt said this thing about the way he uses dots and how he constructs lines with that. And then he started saying this thing is like, oh, I have a theory of the dot in painting. And I was like, what do you mean? And I think there's something really exciting. And I'm sure if all of your artists, you probably all have this same feeling, but there's something really exciting when someone has an intuition about something, but they can't articulate it. And they're like clunkily trying to say, there's something I can feel about this, but I can't put into words. And I think that's the point that you were. And we thought, let's use the podcast to read and think about some things about this. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that before I introduce the first text.
Okay. So this is just another set of disclaimers, really. Maybe it's more of a feeling, not a theory. That's the first thing to say. Probably not an actual theory. Maybe it's an artist's theory. It's about a certain kind of mark making, which isn't just dots. It's something about broken lines. It's something about things that aren't flowing, things that aren't necessarily defining things very clearly. And it came from looking at Philip Guston's, I won't show loads of these, but his late 60s ink drawings in between, to put it very simply, the bit where Philip Guston was thought of as an abstract painter and the bit where Philip Guston was thought of as a figurative painter. And in between them, he edged towards objects with this series of ink drawings, which this one's just a line, but it's made up of multiple marks. And that kind of got me, and I really liked that. And then I think, we saw that the Emily Cam and Kngwarray show was on, who was an Aboriginal dot painter from Australia. And then we realised that there was also a neo-impressionism show on at
National Gallery.
The National Gallery in London. And we thought, that's a pretty good coincidence. So we went to see the shows, we found some texts, and now we're comparing all these different kinds of dots. To go back to the idea of the theory of the dot, there isn't a theory, but a better question is, what does the dot do differently in each of these artists? And maybe through that we can think through the dot.
So we started with Seurat because we had gone to this show. Seurat was a bit like minimalism. It was an artist that had studied in art school, and I was like, I got it. I know this. We went to the show. I think I was talking really loud about how I kind of like knew everything. Now looking back, it's so embarrassing because then I started reading and I was like, oh my God, I said so many stupid things in the show. But I read all these different texts around it, and I end up on the Linda Nochlin text because I really love her. And I think it's a really great text to think about the politics of the work in a really interesting way. But quite a few of the texts that I read about Seurat hate this text. So just to say that this is absolutely non-canonical text, there's a lot of books that are like, this text is horrible, she completely misinterpreted Seurat. I read all those texts, and I read the Linda Nochlin text again, and I'm like, Linda Nochlin's awesome. Those people are wrong.
I like this text. This is the only one
It's a great text.
That's fine. So it's about Le Grand Jatte. Go on then. Where do you want to start with it?
So maybe Sara, she has this quote from historian and philosopher Ernst Bloch, and she uses kind of to begin, and she says, "This picture is one single mosaic of boredom, a masterful rendering of the disappointing longing and the incongruities of a dolce far niente." And I love the idea of a painting about boredom, and that's gonna come at the end as well when we talk about Kusama.
Kusama. Let me bring up my notes on this. So what was your first quote about boredom?
It was about boredom.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, that? Because, like, it's hard to get back to historical, old paintings. It's from the late 19th century. And the whole of Nochlin's text is about it being, like, super specific to the, like, contemporary fashions and, like, the actual things that would have gone on. And, being about, like, a particular kind of bourgeois life, right? Like all these people who don't know how to, like, be free of work, and they're kind of like whiling away their Sunday. And it was really helpful, this text, because it helped me look at this painting, which is, well, to me, as a 21st century person, I guess it is kind of boring on like a more straightforward level. It was like, I don't really know how to look at it. So it really helped me look at the painting and kind of make sense of it in the context.
No, it's just because I think there's boredom in two levels, and I think that came up in other people's texts as well, that this kind of like repetition of the dots sometimes create an image that is boring to the viewer, but it's also, you can feel the boringness of the labor of like making all those dots. But there's something about like, and I think Nochlin will talk about this, there's something about like the repetition and kind of the mechanics of it, and the kind of like stopping yourself from thinking of yourself as this like unique author that has all this romantic expression, but it's just you have to go there and you have to go to work. And I think that's what makes Nochlin as a feminist historian really interesting, because she's kind of related that to maintenance work and reproductive work and women's work and kind of this idea of like this kind of, and craft work, right? The work that is not recognized as usually artwork in a sense.
For like the theory thing, right, there's a really early quote that she says that I thought, yes, because it says, if Seurat, rather than Paul Cézanne, had been positioned as the paradigmatic modernist painter, the face of modern art would have been vastly different. I was like, yes, that's my theory validated. But then she says, but such a statement is, of course, itself utopian, or at very least insufficiently historical. And then I was like, oh no. It was part of advanced art's historical destiny in the later 19th and early 20th centuries to retreat from the worldly, the social, and above all from the negative and objectively critical position iterated in Seurat's art. And so that's interesting because she kind of posits this like potential, what's the word? Speculative history, alternative history, whatever. And then she kind of says, but it was never going to happen because of exactly the reasons that she then goes on to lay out about his like kind of critical stance. But then I thought this does, you know, when we go on to Kngwarray and Kusama and Guston as well. Here we go. Basically, she says that it was inevitable that modernism's kind of high point would be this idea of the pure painting, the realm of the atemporal, the non-social, the subjective, and the phenomenological. Yeah, in other words, a pure painting as synonymous with modernism, which I guess is that like Clement Greenberg idea of like the high point of painting in the 20th century being like abstract expressionism or something, which of course Guston then kind of has this like crisis about in the 50s, in the 60s, sorry. So I did think that was like good, but then she does, you know, she kind of goes on in a different way really.
I think your theory is right. I think what you're proposing, okay, I'm excited when you came up with the theory, is that I think what you're proposing is exactly like a different genealogy. So when we started like our first podcast, it was about this kind of hand-sized sculptures by Duchamp. And one of the texts that we read is this Helen Molesworth text, where she says, what if we told a history of sculpture when sculpture, instead of going from the plinth to the floor, like in Rosalind Krauth's history, it went from the plinth to the table. And then you suddenly see all these different things and all these different things, ways to think about sculpture. So I do think, to me, it's quite exciting to think about this genealogy of modern painting that is concerned with like mass production and craft and like doesn't fetishize authorship and thinks about production in a very different way. And then what happens if we think about all these things that we think about canonical painting as like secondary, and we can like replace, you know, what if Yayoi Kusama's paintings occupy the space that abstract expressionism and pop art was occupying in America? I mean, then you have a completely different history of painting. And I think that's what's exciting to me about the theory, because it's a theory that has very different relations with like the body, with like mechanics of production, with maintenance, with boring, with like reproductive labor, which is a very specific type of labor, with even like the pedagogy of what painting does and teaching does. So, sorry, I'm just saying, I still think the theory is a theory.
The problem with Seurat for me, I'll read the quote actually. So this is Linda Nochlin on the dot. For Seurat, the dot resolutely and consciously removed himself as a unique being projected by a personal handwriting. He himself is absent from his stroke. There is no sense of the existential choice implied by Cézanne's constructive brushwork, of the deep personal angst implied by Van Gogh's, nor of the decorative, mystical dematerialization of form of Gauguin. And then there's a line, maybe it's later, where she calls it, or she quotes someone else, Félix Fénéon, when he described the uniformity of the technique of pointillism as a monotonous and patient tapestry. And that monotony and patience, like this painting took 2 years to make, and all the while he's making all these studies along the way. And that is slightly different. It's definitely very different from Guston. It's definitely very different from Kngwarray. And it's like, he's too patient. He's too like technical or something. The dot is doing something very different here than it's doing in the kind of work that I was really excited about. And yet there is something interesting about its connection to, I guess, depersonalization, or what have I heard? What have I looked here? There's something about how it makes you look at the mark. And that, I think, is still connected. Like, it makes you look at each one of those dots and then put it back together as a whole. So it makes, like you were saying about the labour of making and the labour of looking, like it doubles that labour and gives it over to you as a viewer. It doesn't make looking harder, but it makes you, like, aware of looking in a different way, I think, to whatever we call that, you know, that kind of movement that's, like, flowing and what does she calls it later? The impatient slash and scumble of what Fénelon denominated as virtuoso painting. I think that is quite interesting how the dot functions in Seurat. But do you want to talk about the kind of critical aspects as well?
If any of you had listened to this podcast before, I fall in love with people. I definitely did not fall in love with Seurat. This is not. So there's a whole critique of the bourgeois and the weak, and the way those figures are there. But I think to me, the technique is more interesting. Or there's something about. We went to this show, and it was this person who collected all this new impressionist painting, and it's just really funny because Seurat does this, and then suddenly there's 25 people in Europe that are doing exactly the same thing,
isn't it?
And it's because it feels like now someone invented an Instagram filter, and then suddenly everybody's sending selfies with an Instagram filter or something, and there's something I love that there's something about authorship and labor and how this passes around that I think is quite interesting, that people just saw this and they were I can't copy, I don't know, if you look at the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, they all have very specific personalities. They're doing work that is very individual. And there's something really interesting about Seurat doing this. And then suddenly all these different people doing their own versions of Seurat. In a moment of industrialization where people are trying to understand the relation between industrial production and craft and art. So to me, that is more interesting than the content of the work, in a sense, is that what happened in that, what the dot made possible in the sense of demystifying what being an artist is, or who gets to do these things, or there were all these portraits starting to become really trendy to commission
Pointillist
someone to do your pointillist. So it's this, it's also this narrative, it's this super political critique of the bourgeoisie, and then there's all these really rich people paying people to do again, it's an Instagram filter, paying someone to make a big portrait of them with dots. It's really interesting.
It's does everyone know Michael Landy? He was a British artist who did this thing called Breakdown, where he destroyed all his possessions, everything, including his passport, right? It's really famous, YBA piece of the 90s. And then I used to work for the Zabladovich collection, who are not very nice people, and they were also big art world collectors. And then the next thing Michael Landy did after Breakdown was loads of pencil drawings of rich collectors, which is so weird, isn't it? But I guess that just happens, doesn't it? Anyway, he did one of Anita Zabladovich, and I always thought that was kind of weird. But yeah, the pointillist, loads of them ended up doing these portraits of their patrons. Should we move on to Kngwarray? Have you got more to say on Nochlin? I liked her thing about specifics. Basically, she talks a lot about the specifics, right? She talks about how the dress, for example, is really contemporary. It's the fashion of the day. It's not just a general late 19th century vibe. And she uses all these other examples of other paintings where they get that, but then they also have a kind of classicism, billowing shirts or whatever it is. And he's no. So she's no, Seurat, literally that is what, if you were a fashionable bourgeois lady in Paris in 1885, you'd be wearing that, which is really interesting. But then she says this thing about people then becoming just types, and it being it almost has this satirical edge, about, there's a whole section about the wet nurse, which is really interesting, how she becomes basically reduced. This is literally a wet nurse is someone who literally nurses your child for you, breastfeeds your child for you. So it's a very, very specific kind of childcare and reproductive labour that's done by someone else. Super interesting on its own terms. But they also had, in Paris, they had these, or at least in France, they had these hats with these long things, trails. And anyway, he reduces the wet nurse to her hat, and that doesn't, this specificity and this typology kind of clash for me. And that's when I kind of lose it, because I really like the idea of it being really specific. Because I was thinking about specificity the other day, and how it's nice that art always forces you to consider what's actually in front of you, because that is not something that happens very much anymore, right? You're always considering this as an allegory of something else, or this is an example of something else, or this is a type of this. But the best art, lots of art, says, no, this is this. And it's there's a literalism. And that from our sculpture episodes about Duchamp, the ready-made, and minimalism, this kind of literalism of you need to look at this thing that's right in front of you. And I like that about the dot, about as a mark. And I like that about the specificity. And then I start to lose interest when it becomes this set of types that's being arranged as a satire of the boredom of bourgeois life.
There's something really interesting that happened at the show as well, and I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the dots as a way of painting in terms of scale. These paintings look very different when you see them really close because you can't really see them when you see them far away. But, and this was very surprising, they look amazing on your phone. So you'll be in front of a painting and you're like, oh, I don't know if I get this painting. This is really weird. And then you see it through your phone and there's the most amazing like light effects and textures and stuff that happen through the reproduction, which I had never experienced before. And that was really, just really weird in terms of like what you get from the painting and the way to look at the painting and stuff.
It is weird, yeah. The technique was twofold. There was pointillism, which he actually only hit on in this painting, because in the studies he was still, and she says this in the text, Nochlin says this in text, in the studies he was still using this kind of like dashed line, which I actually kind of am more into really as a mark. But then he gets the dots, and then it was called like chrominoluminosity or something. Basically a kind of pseudo-scientific idea that you could make colours out of other colours, out of pure colours using dots, and that would make them even more vibrant. And then I think that's something to do with the phone, where it kind of pops on your phone in a really interesting way. R.I.P. Sara, you would have loved Instagram.
I have a really good sentence to finish.
Oh yeah, okay, cool.
So she said, Seurat might be seen as the ancestor of all those who rejected the heroic and apolitical sublimity of modernist art in favor of a critical practice of the visual. That's pretty good.
Good old Seurat. Okay, should we do the Kngwarray text then?
Yes.
Okay, so we actually read loads of texts. So Emily, Cam, Kngwarray. I might not be saying that perfectly, and spellings of her name change depending on who's writing, so I might not be spelling it correctly. But she was an Aboriginal painter from the northwest of Australia. I don't know, it goes into detail about her country and stuff in the text that we'll talk about. And what's super interesting is that, I thought this was a weird coincidence. Seurat only really had a 10-year career because he died at 31. And Kngwarray only had about 10 years of painting because she only started painting at 86 or something. Was that right? No, she
died in 96.
She died in 96. She died in the late 80s. She had about 10 years of painting. Before that, she did some batik. And before that, did other things that really heavily influenced her painting that are more connected with kind of, I guess, like traditional...
rituals, so lots of body painting on like women, and then sand.
Yeah, sand drawings as well. So this was the best text that I read, partly because it did a lot of things in one text, which is really good. It's called Two Worlds, One Vision by Margo Neale, and mainly because it really describes her technique in such an amazing way.
So one of the things to say is that we saw this advertised, and we're thinking about the dog. Let's go to this show and look at it. And I just want to say, if you ever have a chance, this was the most incredible painting show I've ever been.
Yeah.
This is the opposite of Seurat. You absolutely do not get it through the images. Like these paintings they're just incredible in terms of like what they do with like color and with layers and with movement. It's just, I think I said this before in this podcast, like I'm not a painter, and I've always been like, why do people paint? And then sometimes you see a painting, you're like, oh my God, this is how people paint. Like painting does things that nothing else in the world can do. Like this. If you ever have a chance to see her work, like it's just outstanding. Really, it's like incredible.
Whole rooms, this is it. Is this Tate Modern? So whole rooms of the Tate Modern, like big galleries, it would be like every painting was from like 1992. It's like her work ethic. Well, I guess that's not the way to phrase it, but like the amount of work she produced was just amazing. And she shifts styles. Like Margo Neale kind of says that, she's modulating the same kind of ultimate subject matter and story, but to my eye, to my kind of Western Eurocentric eye, she's like radically shifting styles. 1994, 1993. Like I'd have a breakdown, like shifting from that to that, but she didn't. And there's apparently the last year, like 95, 96, which I don't have any images of, she's working really quickly. And there's a hint that she knows that, maybe she's not going to be around for loads longer, so she's really interested in making works, and she works really quickly and makes this like really kind of free set of painting. Anyway, absolutely fantastic artist. What about the text? She spends the whole first page like telling me not to try and theorise Kngwarray's painting in relation to European painting, which is really fun. Emily Cam Kngwarray's abstraction neither belongs nor owes anything to the lineage of mainly male modernist artists who preceded her. The painter was elderly, black and female. Her life, work and artistic practice defy conventional attempts at definition. The paintings refuse to be categorised as abstract expressionist, minimalist, fauvist, or to confirm other seemingly appropriate labels that might be used to describe them. Such attempts are only temporarily satisfactory, and analysis beyond a certain point invariably confuses and confounds. However, the persistent and irresistible desire to read her work through stylistic equivalence is illuminating. It exposes the difference of her work rather than its similarities to other styles. And for this reason, it is worth doing. So I was really worried, but then I was saved at the end. So I was kind of okay with it. But I'm not trying to say that Kngwarray's a pointillist. There's clearly no connection, and it goes through many reasons why Kngwarray would have had no influence, and there's kind of no notion of her inheriting anything from any Western traditions, apart from using paint on canvas, which was a kind of interesting moment in post-colonial Australia. That's maybe for another podcast.
But I think it's good. So it's really interesting. So we read a lot. It was really hard to find a good text, I think, on Kngwarray. And there's lots of videos online of different creators that work with this, and it's really interesting because they all say this about like placing her in that thing, and then like 3 paragraphs later they were like, well, but you can think about de Kooning when you look at the work, and you can look at Jackson Pollock, and it's constantly there because those are the references that we have. But there's this amazing text in Aboriginal Australian art written by Howard Murphy, which is like an art anthropologist who's quite influential, and he gets cited in all these papers, and it's really long, so we didn't put it as a recommendation, but it's really, really good, and we'll put it on the website. But the thing he said, which I think is really interesting, he has a discussion with an art historian who's saying like, you have to treat these words completely different. They exist in a different way. They need to be exhibited in a different way. All Indigenous art need to be completely separate. And what he's kind of proposing is you have to take the work on your own terms, but there is something as well that is fetishizing in thinking that you just include these works in like, the Tate Modern or like a Western art environment, and you refuse to let them participate in discourse. And I kind of love that, because to me, the whole point of inclusion is not that you like include people in, is that the moment that you expand and kind of like include other people in, you completely destabilize everything. And I think that's what's exciting, and not to see about, Kngwarray as a way to like, justify and be like, oh, this should be art because this relates to other things. But it's like, I think that work, which is so amazing, just questions so many assumptions that we have about painting, and the idea that then that can make us rethink the way that we think about painting, because we have to deal with the fact that this is an incredible painting. I find that conceptually really exciting. And that's what we thought, that if there's this theory of the dot, that this theory of the dot should not be based just on like European and American painters, but it's
not like a line. It's not like a kind of modern
things.
line.
But
one thing she troubles is this notion of abstraction, which, if you've listened to the podcast, it happens over and over again. Painters being like, kind of refusing that distinction, and obviously the Western eye kind of reads Kngwarray's work often as like abstract, but there's so many moments where there's kind of motifs of I don't know if we've gone in here at the moment. Anyway, there's like moments where there's clearly like emu footprints being depicted, and the curators in the Tate show make a lot of lots of marks being connected to yam roots and stuff. But because of this, and because that's interesting to think about, okay, so it kind of looks to the Western eye maybe like abstract painting, but has this connection to country and to land. But then the way that they like illustrate this in actually this essay as well, they keep like putting pictures of the land in, like pictures of the area where Kngwarray is from, which seems like totally the wrong way to think about it, because she's not, even if she's making like paintings that are like with the country or like of or part of the country, she's not making paintings like of an impressionist would make a painting of a reflection of a ghost gum in a waterhole. That looks like an impressionist painting. That doesn't look like an Kngwarray painting. And they did it in the Tate show. They had all these like drone shots of like of top-down shots of the land, which obviously Kngwarray is like someone who's like in her 80s, in the 1990s, probably didn't spend a lot of time like really high up in the air, like videoing her own land. So like I got it that it kind of looked a bit like her paintings, but that surely is just another like reductive reading. But anyway, that was just like a personal bugbear. But let me do this thing because it's so good.
Oh, I want to read this it's like Howard Murphy thing about abstraction that this person is citing here, and he says, the more knowledge one gains of the designs, the less abstract they may seem, yet the more the processes of abstraction become apparent, which is a really great way to think about the abstraction in your work.
The physical power and verve of gestures that produced Kngwarray's marks could be described as radical, aberrant, and utterly extraordinary. No matter how small or large the marks or the scale on which she worked, the quality that most characterises her mark making and distinguishes it from that of other Central and Western desert artists is her lack of concern for precision, neatness, and regularity. And lack of concern is a really useful phrase. I think we were trying to find a similar phrase for previous artists, but I can't remember who it was. Lack of concern for precision, neatness, and regularity. Her attack on the canvas exhibits randomness, robustness, and complete assertiveness. Her most characteristic works are many-layered. Lines and dots with raggy edges overlap as she employed double and even triple dipping, frowned on. Direct frontal application and the rapid thrust with which she dumped the paint onto the surface meant the colours often did not run but retained their clarity, as you can see in that image there. The brush splayed with the dramatic force of her action. Hollowing out at the centre, you can really like feel it happening, right? Hollowing out at the centre and feathering at the edges to create on the canvas a petrified impression of its strands. Dubbed the dump style, which is such a good thing to dub something. This technique is sometimes varied with the twirling of the brush to create a dynamic pom-pom shape, which I think is what's happening in these ones. As Untitled 19, she kind of mentions her image in the text. Each mark is left to retain the character of its original impression. Even in the most densely overlaid surfaces, every mark is individually identifiable. I think that's such a lovely description of very specific things that are happening when you're painting, which you don't get a lot of, especially in texts about Kngwarray, but in general in texts about painting. They're my most favourite bits when people are like really getting into the knowledge of like a gesture or like a move or something.
I think there's something. So I read a gazillion other texts on Kngwarray because I just find it so hard we just went to the Tate and I just hate the Tate text so much and I just couldn't get a way to think about it. So there's this other text that I read, I think it was on the same book that you sent, Matt, called by Jatte. I can understand my handwriting, but we could put it on the thing. But they had this thing, they said that her painting was painting as documentation of the act of painting, which I thought was really nice. And
say it again.
Painting as documentation of the act of painting.
Yeah, that's nice.
And that's something that comes a lot in all these texts about like how people use dots, that there's like a performance side to it, that there's like an embodiment. It's like you can see the body that has made these marks, and it's like a whole body gesture. They talk a lot about that in Kngwarray painting, that she paints with her whole body. Like, there's amazing photos. She just has this amazing canvas on the not a floor, they're a bit raised, and then she's just like moving her whole body and her arms to painting. But there's something about the canvas as these other surfaces. So the story of how she started painting canvas is really great because and you can find interviews with the people that actually got her the canvas, which are all very weird. What do you mean they're weird? The interviews are weird. Yeah, with the person that got there's something very infantilizing and stuff about the whole. These are complicated colonial relationships. Yeah. So, and Kngwarray was someone who was really important in her community. So she did do all this like sand. I'm gonna call them paintings, but they're just like with her fingers on the sand. And she did all this like line body painting, which is where those lines come. Then there was this kind of social project, and they started doing like batik. So they started doing these marks in batik to sell. And then there's about 4 texts when they're like say how Kngwarray just found batik so boring to make as a process. And she was like really frustrated. And I love, because other texts are be like, what did this person find this boring? And I'm like, good for Kngwarray, just telling everybody like, why are you making me do this stuff?
Boring.
Yeah. I love it.
That's good.
And then at some point, she sees some canvas and people saw some canvas and they're like, why are we not painting on that? And then they bring the canvas and start doing the thing. But I think there's something really interesting about the idea of like treating the canvas as these other things. So the beauty, like the works with the lines are so
These ones, or
no, the ones that have, at the end of the show,
yeah.
like the black lines, they're like incredible. And then I didn't realize, but those are like the same gestures she would do on all these other women on this ceremony, on this line. So she's like treating the canvas as these bodies for this ritual. And I think that's why she can go through all these different paintings as well, because this is something that she has been doing for like 70 years by that point. But that is something that came, I think, a lot in different ways in the different texts, like the idea of like the dot being a painting process that has this kind of like attunement and meditative state, a vibration, a rhythm, movement, a relation to ritual and to embodiment. And it does that on the maker, on the viewer. There's like this kind of transitional ritual object. And then it made me think about Seurat again, because Seurat does feel like that when you're standing in front of it. Is that you have this feeling of this person putting all those dots there and that vibration, and you can like participate in that vibration. Like it does something to your body as a viewer that is very different from other types of painting, for example.
There's a bit where Neale says about Kngwarray, she was not concerned about running out of paint halfway through a stroke or even continuing in the same place after reloading the brush. And that made me think back to those Guston ink drawings. But he was very concerned. I think Guston displays a lot of concern in the late 60s. He's having a tricky time. And I think these drawings are a document of someone having a tricky time making a line. So dots are like doing a different thing visually, or dots, when I'm talking about dots, I'm talking about this kind of broken line, or like line that isn't a line or something. Like it's doing something different visually, but it's also doing something different for the artist, which is something that comes up again and again in these podcasts as well, is that's kind of what I'm always fascinated by, is like the relationship between the artist and the work. And I'm not as always thinking about the relationship between the viewer and the work. So but what you're saying is interesting, right? Because some of these works put the viewer in that relationship, or they kind of like reenact that relationship for the viewer in this kind of performance way. Do we have time to talk about Kusama?
You're the time control person.
Well, it's 7:00.
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. All right, Kusama, this was interesting. So you found this text, right, Andrea?
Yes.
This is a great book. It's really interesting.
So this came from like a podcast by Helen Molesworth about Kusama. And I've been looking about Kusama. I was just watching, she has a documentary called Infinity something. It's free on UbuWeb. If you don't know what UbuWeb is, come after this and I'll introduce it to this amazing portal to artist films. But she was like, Helen Molesworth, which comes up a lot in the podcast because I'm a massive fan, was interviewing different people, and she was interviewing this person. She was like, oh, I wrote this book about punctuation in writing and have a chapter on Kusama. And I was already like, oh my God, this sounds amazing. And the book is super interesting. And so she has this first chapter on like the dot, and it's on Kusama's work. And it has this amazing constant definitions of what the dot does. And this is what I thought was going to be helpful. So for example, this one here right at the beginning, it says, polka dots display a resistance to congealing. We cannot hold them readily as they are held together by empty space that they also delimit. Though made of circular forms, polka dots are not circular. Rather, they're circulate, they're circumlocutions that both cover and expose. And that's something that comes a lot in Kusama use of the dot, this idea of like accumulation and obliteration. And then I thought, oh, that kind of like applies to Kngwarray as well, in a sense. Maybe you can show the one, my favorite. I love that.
So where's the painting? It's like a quiz.
But this is when labor comes again. It's like you can look at this and you can imagine the amount of labor, the amount of hours, the body that made that, and also like being a woman and being a migrant woman, and how that gets value in terms of like authorship and craft and ideas of like originality and expression and things like that.
But it's in the text, but she was really into dots, and that's what she's known for now. If you don't know who we're talking about right now, you will do if I Google her, because you'll see her, and also these things, these like infinity mirror room things. Are these things that people are aware of? With like mirrors and dots everywhere, and I guess people taking photos of themselves mainly. But they began with these. These are kind of the newer versions, but these kind of phallic soft sculptures that are covered in dots. And she was doing these in the 60s. These are, like I said, all this stuff is the kind of later work. But what gets written about in the text is the earlier work. And the point I was getting to, which for some reason took me ages, is that she was interested in, now it's just the dots, but she always talked about it as nets as well. And a net is like what's the phrase? Like the negative version of the dot, right? Like it's all these holes that are made by the thing. And this work I thought was really interesting, accumulation of nets, because you can see I think this is like a collage of photographs of painted surfaces, and you can see that what's being painted here is not the dot, but the thing around the dot. So you're making a hole by painting around it, which is obviously just basically the opposite of what we've just been talking about for an hour.
Can I go? There's like a really good quote from Yves Sedgwick on the Kusama text.
That was nice, yeah.
And it's about scale, and I think scale is really important in relation to what we're thinking about the dot in terms of the three painters. Whatever the scale, one bump on a surface, or even three, won't constitute texture. A repeated pattern like polka dots might, but it depends on how big they are or how close you are. From across the room, you might see them as a flat sheet of gray. At a few feet, the dots make a visible texture. Through a magnifying glass, you'll see an underlying texture of paper or fabric unrelated to the 200 or 300 rounded shapes that make a big design. Texture, in short, comprises an array of perceptual data that includes repetition, but whose degree of organization hovers just below the level of shape of structure. And there's something really nice about this idea of the dot never constituting a solid thing that you can grab and hold, that at the end is always escaping you.
Yeah, that line makes me think a lot about sculpture as well, because sometimes this is a very simplistic thing, but you can think of traditional questions of how to make a sculpture is like how to make it stand up, and normally there's an armature, and then there's the thing on the armature. And surface kind of there's the thing that is you're looking at, and then the thing that holds the thing up. And surface disrupts that, because it's both of those things. It could be both those things at the same time, right? It's the colour, but it's also a shape, and it could also be a form. And I was talking to someone I was interviewing the other day, and someone was talking about texture, and I got really excited, and they didn't really know why, but it was because I'd just read this, which is always a good way to scare off a potential student. What else have you got for Kusama?
Yeah, so I have a quote. She's quoting critic called Paul Schuritz. I don't know them. And he says, the obsessive act of covering, destruction of boundaries, identities, gradually becomes equivalent to the ritual of uncovering, stripping away of the ego. Individual self-destroying, mask parody clustering is transcended. I don't know, there's something about, it goes back to authorship. Authorship in Kngwarray, for example, is super interesting, because there's a whole thing about expression. It's clearly we recognize her as a massive artist, but at the same time, she's repeating, I think about those paintings that are oral history, that they're being repeated, and every time you tell a story, that is part of a oral history, you're sort of changing a bit, but you're also really holding that original meaning together. There's something about the way the dot questions authorship, in a sense, in all those practices, because it kind of creates a technique that is not...
It's not held by one person, right? I was thinking of this story, which I don't know where it's from, so I might have just made it up. Picasso, in his later years, I think of a really drunk guy, and he's making loads of money at this point, loads and loads and loads of money. And he's painting on plates, and they've got a big stack of plates next to him. And they basically put the plate in front of him, and he does a really amazing thing really quickly, and then swigs his red wine and passes it on. And then they sell that for $1 million. And that is true, and that's absolutely accurate fact. And the reason he can sell that is this notion of style, right? The notion that you see the Picasso and you think, God, he's good. Or whatever, whatever people say when they're you're a genius, or whatever. And then, and it's the dot doesn't let you do that. Even when it's Kngwarray's dot, and she does it in this very specific way, and it's oh, I love that dot. But it doesn't let you say why that dot is, I don't know. I just keep doing it for the podcast. I just keep doing this move, which is that. And if you know what I mean by that, then that's basically the theory of the dot. So you're not doing that anymore. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. I don't know about Kusama. It's I really like the writing on her here. But all I can think of is late, now Kusama, where it's all...
Yeah, I feel you're ruining this.
I know, I'm so sorry. I'm showing all the modern... Yeah, I know. Because this is so cool. These are so cool. This is, I think, is made of chads, like the little paper hole punch things. I think that's so cool. And the film is great. This self-obliteration film, which is that's what you read. It was a description of that film, where she's like covering male and female performers like in public spaces. They're naked and being covered in dots, and they're all protests against the Vietnam War. And yeah, she's like a really political and interesting artist. But all I can think of is like, who did she collaborate with? Like Yves Saint Laurent or whatever. I don't know. People queuing for the Infinity Room.
Yeah, don't let Matt ruin Kusama for you. She's like incredible.
But I kept meaning to ask this, like, what it's hard to find like great images of the earlier work, but maybe that's just one of those features, of being, like you say, being a woman in a male-dominated scene, being a migrant in like a very American moment. This, I included this because I thought it was interesting. This painting, Infinity Net from 1961, which is massive. That is the whole back of that gallery wall is the painting. You can just see the top edge there. But it doesn't exist anymore because I guess who stores that for you? Like if no one buys it, you haven't got the space, you get rid of it, whatever. So it's hard to like show the pictures of the cool stuff because otherwise it's just like terrible screen grabs from like the Ubu web version of like a 16mm film. So luckily it's a podcast, so it's audio only, isn't it? Anything else we should say about dots?
Can I go through my list of terms?
Yeah, go. Oh yeah, cool.
See. So I had evidence of mechanics of production, labor, time, attunement, meditative, vibration, rhythm, on the maker and on the viewer, movement, ritual, embodiment, diachronic, performance, repetitiveness, maintenance, boredom, reproductive labor, migrant labor, care, touch, alienation, craft, decorative, authorship and expression, originality, repetition of forms, pedagogy, foreground, background, scale, accumulation, and obliteration.
Nice. So we hit all of those?
I don't think we hit all of those, but I think there's something interesting to start thinking about those things and then go back to think about looking at painting, the same way that now I look at sculpture and I'm aware of that kind of like different genealogies of sculpture. Is really interesting to go back to painting and think about a history of painting that kind of prioritize different things. Because I think we've been following even though we do have really weird choices sometimes of like the people that we look at, we're still like framing them in like a very traditional way of historicizing painting. And I think it would be interesting to like, especially things about, I think I'm in my everyday practice of thinking, I do a lot of work on like intellectual property and things like that. So that's one of the reasons I'm looking about. Kusama is a really interesting case in intellectual property because a lot of famous artists took a lot of stuff from her. And that affected her massively, and is about like her position. But there's something about like craft and decorative and why certain types of painting get like overvalued as like intellectual or like expressive or things like that. And I'm quite interested in a quiet history of painting, like a history of painting that is interested in like craft and skill and time and things that might be usually criticized or ignored or considered like anti-intellectual or things like that, when actually they're potentially quite political and sophisticated. You're the theory, it's your theory, so you should finish. You should like give us like the final word.
No way, man. I hate conclusions. It's awful. Normally I just say, if this was the podcast, I'd just be like, yeah, I think that's probably all right.
Yeah.
And then we'd stop recording.
No, Matt is always like, no one listens to a podcast from us more than an hour, Andrea. We really should stop now.
Let's stop. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Something a little bit different. A few more jokes than I'm comfortable with. I think it exposes me as a very needy speaker. Really need everyone to laugh at my little stupid jokes. But I do that, I think, in all conversations, whether it's with myself, with another person, or with a large audience. Thanks again to everyone at NCAD. Thanks again to Fire Station and Sarah. Thanks to Andrea. And thanks to Seurat. Georges Seurat. Thank you, Georges Seurat. All right, that's enough from me. Glad you enjoyed the podcast, which you must have done if you stayed right till the end. Until next time, good luck and good night and good morning and goodbye.